Hello, I'm Sable Schultz, she, her pronouns, Manager of Transgender Services at the Center on Colfax. Welcome to our Out for Health panel discussion on human trafficking. Today we are talking with Ames Babich, they, them pronouns with the Laboratory to Combat Human Trafficking, uh, Maria Martine, she, her pronouns with Streets Hope, and Erin Atencio, she, her pronouns with the Gathering Place. They will be discussing the topic of human trafficking in relation to the LGBTQ community and some of the impacts that we are seeing because of COVID 19. Thank you all for being here today. Um, Ames, I'm going to go ahead and start the PowerPoint.
Thank you, Sable.
All right. Oops. And is that coming up for everybody okay?
Yes.
Okay.
Awesome. Thank you, Sable. Well, as you mentioned, I'm here with the Laboratory to Combat Human Trafficking. We have a really big vision, and that is to end human trafficking. But the lab in itself was created knowing that this is such a complex crime. And so we need a laboratory of different minds and ideas and sectors to come together. And so if you can, next slide. And so our vision is really to inform social change that eliminates human exploitation. We do that through 4 main program areas. And I am going to drop the link in the chat of all of these different areas on our site just to save time. But just a quick overview, we have been able to train over 30,000 professionals in the area. Our research and action comes from involving survivors and those with lived experience to really inform the change on how to end this crime. Our hotline and resource directory has over 300 agencies. We actually just had our first weekend of our fall cohort training where we had 36 new volunteers come in to be hotline advocate volunteers. And then also our leadership development program is our internship program, which is both, it can be formal and academic, and we've also just had community members involved. And so I will drop the links to all of those, and especially in terms of general public involvement, it's typically the leadership development program and that hotline advocates that people are going to be most interested in. And so before we all start talking about human trafficking, I think it's really important to start by defining human trafficking and just what that is, especially with more talk in the media about human trafficking. It's really important to know what we're talking about and to know the definitions behind that. Next slide, please. And so human trafficking, by the legal definition, is a severe form of exploitation for labor, including sex, through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. And another way to look at this is that there's an action means purpose model. So at least one thing needs to be happening from each category for it to be actually classified as human trafficking. So in terms of actions, recruitment is typically what we see. It could be recruiting out of a group home, from shelters, at a mall. Harboring is when someone is held against their will. A lot of times that's one of the main things we picture as it comes to human trafficking, although that's not always the case of action. And transport, also a lot of times we think of just transporting from cities or state lines, but it's also really important to note that people can be transported out of their homes or where they're forced to work without ever having the ability to leave. So transportation comes in many different layers. And then in terms of providing, that would be like providing access to your child or to another person so you can, in exchange, maybe get drugs or get housing. So a lot of times that's providing someone else. And then obtaining is overall what the media tends to portray. So that's kind of the movie Taken being snatched and obtained and trafficked that way. And then for the means of force, fraud, or coercion, and these means I'll go into also in the next slide, not yet, but these means are applicable for all those who are above the age of 18. And for those who are below, that this doesn't not need to be happening. But force, fraud, or coercion, so force again is often what we picture most. So someone being held against their will, being beaten, physically abused. And then fraud would be being promised something that isn't followed through. So maybe it's, oh, I can provide you a job and shelter, but the shelter is actually the means of money, so you're not getting paid. And so that type of fraud. But coercion is often psychological, and one of, especially for more vulnerable populations, this is really, really the main mean. And even in those under 18 groups, this is kind of that main psychological manipulation. So being able to say that or threaten someone or a family member, or if you don't do this, I'm gonna go after your sister, something like that. And so that coercion piece is really the psychological impact too. And then a purpose, so either for commercial sex acts or for labor services. And so the TVPA dropped this into 3 categories, and simply speaking, it is minors engaged in sex trafficking, and labor trafficking. The reason 1 and 2 kind of split up is because as a society, we determined that minors cannot consensually engage in commercial sex acts. So there is no such thing as a teen prostitute or something of that nature. And also wanting to highlight that in that case also as well, commercial sex doesn't just mean prostitution. It can be stripping, it can be pornography, really any sex act. Next slide. And so also why we're here today is unfortunately to kind of highlight some of the vulnerabilities of our own population. And so what makes LGBTQIA individuals even more susceptible is first and foremost that abuse, neglect, and rejection. And I think especially in today's day and age, something I really want to highlight about this is really starting to pick up a lot, especially with LGBTQIA youth online. And so we can see this on dating apps, we can see this on chat rooms, places where people are just trying to find that kind of relationship and that kind of acceptance. So that is really, we don't always think of love and acceptance as a tool or an access to public health, but that is really what it comes down to. And then homelessness and aging out of foster care. So, LGBTQIA youth only make up not even 10% of today's population. And a lot of studies have found that over 40% of homeless and houseless youth identify as LGBTQIA. And so really that disproportionate impact and those vulnerabilities of being targeted. And so a lot of times traffickers will just offer a place to stay, and it looks innocent and it looks like it's out of love and care. And the same with aging out of foster care. And I know that Maria and Aaron will talk a little bit more too about how traffickers target very certain places where people are more vulnerable. But a lot of times we see this, traffickers being at foster care centers and at homeless shelters. And then poverty and substance abuse. So as we know, a lot of times in life in general, when we're not experiencing, the love and acceptance, that mental health deteriorates. And unfortunately, we know that LGBTQIA individuals are at higher risk of mental health and suicide and substance use used to simply find that acceptance and find that fitting in and numbing out. And so thinking of being able to really need to have that security of income, because especially when we are isolated and we are alone, sometimes the substance is the only thing that we feel like we can trust in and turn to. So making sure that you have that security of income to provide for that substance or that drug of choice. And the same with poverty, just making sure that you have that security of income to have a place to stay. And then other marginalized identities. So we know this isn't just homophobia or transphobia. This is racism, this is xenophobia, this is ableism. And the more overlapping identities of oppression that we have, the more that we look for acceptance in any way that we can. And especially when we go back and we think about that coercion piece of someone telling you you're accepted, you're valid, you're loved, you're beautiful just how you are, this can make LGBTQIA individuals more susceptible to trafficking. And just a little picture to kind of help people understand the disproportionate impact of LGBTQ youth. So this study was a multi-city study that was done among shelters on the East Coast. And we see here that, again, thinking about how under 10% of youth identify as LGBTQIA. So to have drop-in centers having nearly half of the individuals identify as LGBTQIA, as well as the chunk of street outreach programs and housing programs, is really to give people an idea that this is a much more vulnerable population because of family rejection and family abuse, which will kind of trail into the next slide really quickly. And that same study kind of looked at the different history that individuals have had, and going back to all those push-pull factors that we looked at, that rejection, the mental health, alcohol, family abuse, and then right below that is sexual exploitation. So the fact that over 40% of LGBTQIA homeless individuals were already experiencing sexual exploitation. There have been some other studies that have shown that 90% of trans youth within their first night of homelessness will be approached for sex, and really just kind of putting a spotlight on how important it is to not just love and accept, but to have resources, because we also unfortunately know that, you know, not all housing or not all shelters accept LGBTQIA individuals as well. And then the complexities of identifying survivors, first and foremost, even in parallel movements such as Me Too, we really unfortunately need people who experience these things directly to come forward and speak out. We can't assume things. A lot of times we're wrong and something else could be happening. But first and foremost is language. And I want to kind of highlight two different types of language. An obvious language barrier is not speaking the same language, but also the language around human trafficking. I gave very short human trafficking 101, but that was really also to highlight that a lot of people don't have the language to describe what they're experiencing actually as trafficking. Sometimes people can know that something doesn't feel right, or maybe they think that it might be another form of abuse, but a lot of people don't actually know the definition and the language. Many survivors don't know that they're trafficked or that they experience trafficking till years later. And that's why making sure that we have a shared language and a shared definition is so important. And then unaware of or unable to access rights. We see this a lot of times in immigrant and migrant workers, especially when that fraud is involved or that coercion of threatening family, not really knowing your rights in that area. If someone is also undocumented, not knowing their rights, and who do you turn to when your employer and your main source of contact is the person who is your trafficker. And then social or physical isolation. So that is really also when you have no other form of communication. And then stigma or shame. A lot of times survivors engage in things that they wouldn't have under the circumstances, and having to talk about that and come forward can feel very, very shameful, regardless of it not being their fault. Fear of retribution, a lot of times too, by not only by society, but by traffickers. that fear of what will happen even if they find out, or if I try to get away. So a lot of survivors stay out of fear too. And then distrust of systems, law enforcement, and others is really important to highlight as well. And as we talk more about what trafficking really looks like, a lot of times people are in school and being trafficked, and are seeing healthcare providers and being trafficked, and talking to law enforcement and being arrested for other things. And so many survivors go missed just in plain sight. And so they have reasonable distrust. And again, so that's a real big complexity on who do I turn to. And then some potential COVID-19 impacts on trafficking that we've seen is heightened risk for those already exploited. Just because there was a pandemic, traffickers weren't just like, well, never mind now. Just like everyone was freaking out about finances and money and how to get by, unfortunately, so were traffickers. And so heightened risks is just really not caring about those survivors' overall health whatsoever, and not saying that it was highly cared about before, but really putting them at a heightened risk. And then increased risk of exploitation, especially when we think of, the housing crisis right now, and so many target areas. There's such a heightened increased risk, and so many targeted areas that traffickers are going to. Data response efforts, obviously a lot of response is pretty solely on COVID survivors right now. And so we're not really focusing on all that much outside of that. And then stay in place orders and economic pressures. And so we have seen a massive increase in intimate partner violence as well. And unfortunately, also a lot of times people know their traffickers or live with their traffickers and their family members. So these stay in place orders aren't putting anyone at a lessened risk. And a lot of times the only place that people can go or interact, whether that be work or school, was really what was keeping them safe. And so these stay in place orders are really hard for survivors right now. And then release from detention centers and universities. There was nowhere for a lot of people to go. Not saying that a lot of times the prison system already doesn't just release people into homelessness, which it does, but again, really targeting detention centers, targeting colleges and universities. Traffickers know that people might not have a home right now, and that is really going to lure them in. And then isolation and limited support, as we are all experiencing. And even those survivors who have gotten out of trafficking situations, being isolated and experiencing certain, especially PTSD symptoms of what that means, of what feeling controlled even by the government in a way that is meant to protect us. All of these things are arising for survivors as well. And then online education. So there is an increase in recruitment on online education, and also online education being harmful in the sense of, as I brought up, a lot of times school could have been an only safe place for people to go if they were experiencing trafficking out of their homes. And so all of these are kind of just intersecting things that COVID has had on human trafficking right now.
Thank you, Ames. And I wanted to introduce Maria Martin with Streets Hope to talk about the impact that you're seeing because of COVID-19 in relation to human trafficking.
Thank you. Thanks, Ames. All that information was really helpful, and it's good to get a quick background on human trafficking. I'm Maria. I'm the program director at Streets Hope. Streets Hope, we provide direct services to survivors that have experienced exploitation and human trafficking. The services that we do provide are case management, individual therapy, and group. We do use a trauma-informed approach, and all of our services are individualized and client-centered. So I'm going to talk specifically about what we have seen with our clients who are a part of the LGBTQ community. A lot of what I'm going to share, they've also previously experienced. I think because of the pandemic, it's just greatly increased. So the first one, increased bullying and harassment in their living situation. This kind of goes more to our trans clients, and they are in a community-based housing situation, so they are living with others. And there are other individuals that are transphobic, and so they have really increased the bullying and harassment, especially with the stay-in-place orders, because they're having to be inside the house, where before they were working, they were going to school, they were engaged in community activities. All of that had to stop, and so now they're forced to be inside the house more. So anything from throwing like their food in the trash to a lot of transphobic slurs that are being mentioned. And unfortunately, the staff that's in the house doesn't really get involved. And so it's just our clients, we try to support them the best way we can, but we're not in the house either, and we don't really have that much say-so. So they've really just been trying to deal with these situations as best as they can, but that contributes to isolation and shame and guilt that they've experienced pretty much their whole life. Another thing with the stay in place orders is that, you know, a lot of them were having jobs and moving forward. And so again, this kind of just contributes like, I'm never going to move forward in life. I had a routine that was really, it's really important for individuals with trauma in general to keep a routine and that consistency, and all of that kind of had to stop. And again, they were exposed to more bullying and harassment. The next one, going back to their traffickers, I think a lot of people have a hard time understanding this piece. And I know Ames touched on it, on traffickers can be family members, can be a partner, can be a friend. 90% of our clients or more, that is their situation. And this is what they know. Some of their trafficking began as children and continued their whole life. And so it is more safe to them. It's a more comforting situation than a shelter or other housing options. So that piece is important for people to try to understand that, like, these are people that they know, it's not always a stranger. And in our client specific situations, it is a partner or a family member that they're going back to. And in not all cases, but in these specific cases, they are getting their basic needs met. So they are getting shelter, they are getting food and clothing. And that's not to minimize, you know, all of the trafficking experience that comes with it, the abuse, the forced sex, all of that stuff. But for them, they are getting their basic needs met, and that is what is important to them. They go into survival mode. The unfortunate part as well of them going back to their traffickers is it kind of feeds the traffickers' tactics, especially the psychological tactics of you can't make it without me. You need me. I provide all this stuff to you. Nobody else does. So although they're still getting services from us, we do see a pullback, and the trust is still there, but it's just a little bit more hesitant. So we're happy that they're still in contact with us. It just creates a bigger barrier into empowering them and giving them the tools that, yes, I am going to be able to get out of this situation. I am going to be able to choose the path of my life. It just, that creates a challenge because, yeah, their traffickers are telling them, like, see, I told you, he came back. So we would definitely try to work on that, and again, provide just some tools, the empowerment, the affirmations, and of course, creating safety plans with them. The next one, the slow to no response from healthcare providers. We had a client who had just started a new dosage of hormones right as the pandemic hit. And not that there was a lot of response from healthcare providers before, but this one was, I mean, I think it took finally 2 weeks for the client to be able to contact somebody in the office, because there was a lot of concerns of the side effects that this client was having. And of course, the option to go to the hospital wasn't really a safe option at that time due to the COVID exposure. And then the other part too of, sorry, I lost my train of thought. Yeah, so that was the biggest one with healthcare providers, is that there just was a lack of response or no response in many situations. The hormone one was concerning because it was causing, negative thoughts, behaviors, and almost an increase in trauma response. That also leads into the next one, the increased mental health crisis. Everything that I just mentioned contributed to those crises, but having the imbalance of hormones in addition to the trauma really put our clients in a bad situation, as well as getting the bullying and harassment. Many of them felt like they were being reminded of their trafficking experiences as well. And so we had to do a lot more sessions with them. Our clinicians had to do a lot more sessions with them. Case managers tried to be as hands-on as possible because of that fear of them harming themselves. But yeah, a lot of them were reminded of trafficking situations. And again, to the routine being really important for this population, contribute to more healthy mental health for them. They had their work schedule, their school schedule. When they came home, they knew it was eating, and then it was bed, and then doing it all over. So again, having to stay home really interfered with some positive and healthy mental health for them. And then the last one, no safe shelter or housing options. Our clients that did try to go to like the safer housing or shelter options, if they mention that they were human trafficking victims or survivors, they do not get accepted. And so when they are not allowed to share that contributes, shame to them, and not understanding like, well, why can't I, get this shelter? And then some of the other ones, they just weren't accepting people, or it was just only families. So as I mentioned earlier about going back to traffickers, this was another instance that like, I feel safer with my trafficker than I do in the shelter or on the streets. And let's see. The other issue with the other like transitional housing options is they were pretty much wanting proof that our client did in fact have the gender reaffirming surgery. So it was very invasive. The intake was very traumatic and just inappropriate. And so again, our client didn't have that option, although they say that they do accept LGBTQ and human trafficking survivors. It was still with the piece of like, I need this proof. And so again, all of our clients have experienced these things that I just talked about, but they all were increased due to the pandemic. But if you have any other questions, please feel free to email me and reach out.
Great, thank you, Maria. And now we have Erin Atencio with The Gathering Place.
Hi, I'm Erin, and I'm the physical and mental health manager at The Gathering Place's 1535 High location. And then I'm also the auxiliary shelter program manager for one of the city-ran auxiliary shelters. So kind of to piggyback off of what was already said, I'm gonna do kind of like a higher look at the shelter system and then break it down to what we were able to do and what we were able to not, unfortunately, accomplish during the pandemic. So on April 20th, the Coliseum was brought up to ensure that there was proper social distancing for women and trans individuals who were experiencing homelessness. So a bunch of organizations came together to staff a 24/7 model, which is a new model to Denver. And so there was 300 cots put up here. And the goal was really to, on top of the social distancing, bring all the expertise that we all had and see if we can relook at how we're doing sheltering in a congregate setting for the majority of people experiencing homelessness. And so we did three hot meals a day, showers, laundry, basic services. We had healthcare supports there. So MHCD was someone that would come and do their intakes. If that's the route they wanted, we also had other providers too. We had healthcare on site 24/7. And it was cool because we were able to, because majority of the people were staying with us, providers knew that they could come and connect with clients. And so we also saw an increase in people who were able to find housing, whether that was transitional or a place to go. So after a little bit, the Coliseum was actually stood down as a response to some other things that happened with the other shelters. And so what we did was, rather than doing one massive shelter again, we decided to go into a direction of 3 different placements. And so one was a congregate setting that we kept. And this was for more high needs. They had the ability to do more physical health concerns. People who couldn't do their ADLs, that kind of thing, could go to this congregate setting if maybe their mental health wasn't great and they could not be safe behind closed doors. And we just had some people who just felt more comfortable in a congregate setting. So that was one option. The second tier is motel rooms with service providers on site. So similar to what we did at the Coliseum. And this is the shelter that I actually help with. And so we have providers that can come on site, 24/7 model, 3 meals a day, to help people obtain whatever their goals are. And they're all client-centered. They get to pick, and then we will walk with them through that process. And then the third tier that we moved to was an independent hotel placement, which does have staff, but it was not as hands-on. It was more set up as a model for people who had places, you know, maybe they worked downtown. This one was located more downtown, or they were pretty stable and they just needed a safe place to be. So by dividing it, we were able to meet the needs of the clients in a different way. But it did pose some challenges when it comes to the LGBT population and for trafficking survivors. And so when we set these up, this was open to anyone who was LGBT on the spectrum. And because, like what Maria said, is there are some places where people do ask some pretty invasive questions. Maybe they have certain service criteria, and we wanted to take that off the table and say, nope, everyone is welcome. You can be trans male, you can be trans female, you can be, you know, however you want to identify, that's great. But we want you to be safe. And so we're going to provide that spot. So the benefit at all of these really was that there's one place for everyone to go. So service providers knew they were there. We could get the word out that if you needed a safe place, we could be that. And then on the flip side was that everyone was in one place. And so what we found was, at least at the Coliseum, that people caught on pretty quickly that this is where the people who were women and trans experiencing homelessness were being housed. And so there was times that we had traffickers lined up right outside of the Coliseum or stationed at the bus stop waiting for clients. And so it really brought up some important safety questions about, this model is not working because we now have everyone in one place. And it's actually not safe at this time. So then when we moved over to, sorry, I'm just going to move this, to the multiple locations, again, the benefits were great that people, you know, maybe had their own space. We were able to accommodate a level of different need based on what the client, how they identified, and had intensive wraparound services. But again, the word got out pretty quickly where these locations were. And so For the example of the independent hotel setting, that one is also a functioning hotel. And so we found traffickers and partners and people who maybe were fleeing unsafe situations. Those other people found that and were renting out rooms in the facility. And so they were able to track down some of the guests. And so it's, again, the benefit is that they have their own space and that we were able to shelter safely with COVID, but the traffickers are smart and they're able to find where these guests are staying. Okay. So that's for the auxiliary shelters. And again, because we are open to everyone, it does put more, like what Maria and Ames both spoke about is, there's not that many options. And so it's easy to track down where people are going. So then in regards to the gathering place, the gathering place is a day shelter, and we work with women, children, transgender individuals experiencing homelessness and poverty. And so what we found there was that there was a decrease in people explicitly asking for trafficking services. But after staff would do evaluations with them and really talk to them, we were able to identify that in fact, they were survivors of trafficking or currently victims. But they weren't looking for services at that time, kind of like what Maria said. There just really aren't that many options right now. We also saw an increase of different issues for people who are living outside. So when people would come in, we saw an increase in people with bruises, an increase in people who were using substances, whether it was to cope or it was involuntary. So the data there went up. We also saw an increase, we are seeing an increase in fear of engaging in services. We just don't have the referrals that we used to. And kind of like Maria said, there's not really anywhere, we can refer to different providers, mental health, we can refer to healthcare providers, but everyone is spread really thin. So response time, I would echo with what she said, response time is pretty low right now. And just the ability to send people because of COVID has been pretty limited. And then also with LGBT, we've seen an increase in youth. I didn't put this on the slide, I had forgotten, but we've seen an increase in youth asking for services, and we don't actually at Gathering or at the auxiliary shelters can't accommodate that. So we've done a lot more referrals for Urban Peak and other places that might be more safe for the youth to go. And then the referrals, to kind of talk about that, we've done more referrals for more general broad issues that people are coming to us for, like victims assistance or victims of crime. And again, we're able to say this really sounds like trafficking, but the referral process just looks a lot different than it used to. That's it.
All right, thank you, Erin. So I want to go ahead and open it up now to questions, either if folks want to have any questions they want to hop on the mic for or share out in chat.
Hey, Erin, I have a question for you. I'm just curious. I guess I'm asking you, I'm not sure if I'm ignorant on how people find their ways to the new shelter options you kind of just talked about. I know we had phone numbers that we were calling for when the auxiliary shelters were open, if it was relevant for a caller to our hotline. But what do the new pathways look like? Are people just finding themselves those ways if they are referred to a certain provider? Or what can you recommend there as the most direct route, I guess?
Yeah, so the standard practice right now is for everyone to go through Holy Rosary, which is Samaritan House downtown. So everyone goes there and then they're triaged based on, we have a quick little intake that we do, and they're triaged to either the congregate setting, to the program, or to that more independent living based on whatever that assessment is. What we're finding though is that some people might not feel comfortable going down to Samaritan House for whatever reason. Maybe they've had a bad experience at that one particular shelter. It's also down by a lot of other service providers that serve men. And so even today, actually, I was consulting with someone at a different shelter who said, we can't even get this person to Holy Rosary because the person who has been trafficking her stays in that neighborhood. And so we are looking as the city and all of the organizations working together, which is Catholic Charities, Gathering, and the city, to see if there are other ways to take referrals from other sources versus just Holy Rosary, since we know that is not always the best access point for everyone.
Okay, that's helpful, but I can still differentiate, for example, for a caller, they still have to go that route, but I can say that you can visit there and be assessed for shelter elsewhere.
Absolutely. And then there's another emergency shelter that just opened, which is a congregate setting, and that one will also be triaged at Holy Rosary. The one thing I will say is if anyone is working with someone who is being trafficked and is trans male, to just email me directly and we'll see what we can do. I think that's a population that there's not services for at this time. And so we can try and figure out a safe place for them.
Thank you, that's helpful. And then any hours on when people can come to be triaged there?
Yeah, 4:30.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Any other questions? I kind of have one. So this is maybe mostly for Ames, but I think that each person has probably had a different perspective on this. So recently we've been seeing a lot more media sensationalism and trafficking, like around Pizzagate, around Wayfair, around whatever the newest conspiracy QAnon is coming up with. How does this impact the work that you're all doing around the anti-trafficking movements?
I can start. So I wish I could say that all attention is good attention, but in this case, that's really not the case. And so I think what's really unfortunate about the media sensationalizing, focusing on kids in cabinets and a basement that doesn't exist is that it takes away from the people that you engage with every single day who are being trafficked, whether that is students on a Zoom class or someone you engage with often at your favorite restaurant or wherever you're at. It's really just taking the focus away. And so, yes, could it be helpful that people are starting to get interested? Of course. It's just harmful when people aren't interested in doing the right research and maybe more so falling down Reddit holes.
Yeah, I think those are good points. So I think people have a hard time accepting what trafficking looks like, especially locally, especially in their neighborhood, especially within their family. And so I think it's given people an out to like, yeah, see, I knew like I wasn't wrong about trafficking. I knew it was that. And with what we've seen specifically with our organization is, yeah, like crazy phone calls of things that aren't trafficking. Unfortunately, we've had to turn away some people because it was not trafficking. It was stalking. It was harassing. There was something happening to them, but it just was not trafficking. And so that it's never a good feeling for staff to have to let people know that they are not a good fit for our services. Even briefly speaking with the FBI this past week, they've gotten an increase of calls of just like, well, this person's on the corner. I think they're being trafficked. So yeah, definitely not all attention is good attention. I'm glad there's awareness, but it's just unfortunate that it's not positive or correct information being shared. It's going to be interesting when the human trafficking awareness campaign is released, I believe this next month. So it will be interesting to see with this type of awareness what's being shared versus like what's been in the media the last few months.
And Erin, did you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I would just echo with what everyone is saying, that I think though I appreciate how much people are asking questions and they care, I think there's a lot of misinformation out there. And so I think panels like this are important. And like Maria said, that campaign that's going to come, I didn't realize it was that soon. I think hopefully that will help spread the proper awareness, so that we are making good referrals and getting good information versus just kind of like random stuff all over.
One more quick thing, Sable, sorry.
You're good.
The other thing that I think has been harmful as well is because it paints this picture that it's only children that are being trafficked, and specifically sex trafficked. And so that, again, just minimizes what trafficking really is and who actually are the survivors and victims of trafficking. So I think that's been another harmful piece that the media has portrayed, is that human trafficking is only child sex trafficking.
Sorry, I have one more thing too. I've had some people reaching out to, again, good intentions, but saying let's just have everyone work at hotels and put people in hotels, and that seems like a good idea, or something along that line. And it's like, well, there's a lot of labor trafficking that happens in hotels, and so here's why we need to be super intentional and thoughtful about how we approach this. And it's really hard to explain to someone who has this idea of what it is in their head, and then when the reality comes is like, maybe that's a good idea, maybe it's not. So it's important to ask a lot of questions and really get accurate information before we just move forward with these ideas that we think are going to be really good.
Ames, did you have another thought?
Oh no, I just highly agree with Maria and Aaron.
I guess that brings up a question. What is there an example that any of you all can think of around a person experiencing human trafficking that most people wouldn't associate with possible human trafficking?
I have kind of like a weird example that just came up. Sorry, someone was going to jump in. We, somewhat recently had a case where we had someone who was claiming to be a plainclothes officer looking for a client, and it just wasn't adding up. We would ask questions like, can we see your badge? Can we get your card? Fast forward, they ended up being someone that impersonated a cop and was actually what we believe to be a trafficker trying to gain access to the shelter and to a client. And it was really hard for some people because, this person was very adamant that the client they were after was this horrible person and we needed to arrest her. And luckily we asked questions to really figure out that this was in fact an unsafe situation and it wasn't just an officer. And so I think it's just a reminder to all of us that, of course, there's people that do have warrants and there's things that we should be doing to ensure the safety of the community, but we also need to be sure that we're ensuring the safety of really vulnerable populations. I mean, that's the responsibility of us as providers. So not quite what you were asking, but I think that it definitely is something that's worth being brought up of like, traffickers look like anyone. There's not like a certain look that they have. And so we just need to be really mindful about that.
Good point. Maria?
My fire alarm just went off, so I don't want to talk. And
Okay.
You guys this.
Well, thank you for being here today, Maria. Ames, do you have any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I think that, there's a lot of focus because there is unfortunately a lot of relevance of sex trafficking within families and familial systems. But I think people often forget too that labor trafficking can also happen in families. It's not just like sexual engagement. If you have a family business and you're forcing your children or members of your family to work full time and not paying them, that is labor trafficking. And people don't ever really think about that, especially when we think about the importance of family businesses and whatnot. But that still has that action means purpose, that force, fraud, coercion. So being able to sit with that can be difficult for people too, because also that is a really hard line for people to be able to, especially survivors, to be able to think that that is what's happening.
Good point. So I want to thank you all for being here today. And also, to please be sure to check out our sponsors and exhibitors on our Out for Health virtual resource fair page, and these organizations working to address the impact of human trafficking. Be sure to like and subscribe for future videos like these from the center. And